My name is Rafael Macedo, and I have been living in San Francisco for many years. However, in late 2016, while accompanying my son to school, we were victims of an attempted robbery. The criminals fired at my car, lightly injuring my son's left shoulder. Luckily, the bullet only grazed his skin, but the psychological damage was significant for both of us. Faced with this traumatic event, my wife and I decided to take a sabbatical year and return to our hometown in the countryside of Minas Gerais. The director of the hospital where I work agreed to my leave, showing understanding by maintaining my salary during this period of psychological recovery. This way, I could recover and, when ready, resume my professional activities. Initially, we sought to escape urban violence and enjoy a quieter life. We chose to live with my maternal grandfather on his farm, where he raises dairy cattle and produces cheese and sweets. However, my friend Marcos found out about our move and insisted that I collaborate with the municipal hospital in the town. Marcos, a close friend who is like a brother to me, held the position of health secretary at the time. He mentioned his difficulties in finding doctors for shifts, especially on weekends. After discussing the proposal with my wife and grandparents, we decided that I would work one shift every weekend to assist the local community, even if it was not financially advantageous. The town hospital occupied an old building at the entrance, possibly dating back to the end of the imperial period, although it had undergone several adaptations since then. Its structure was suitable for cases of medium or low complexity, with more severe cases referred to centers with more resources. On my first shift, I met the support team, consisting of about 10 people, including nurses, attendants, porters, cleaning staff, and kitchen personnel. I soon realized that I would be the only doctor on duty. Gradually, I familiarized myself with the operation of the place and became more involved, even taking an additional shift during the week. This experience ended up being therapeutic for me because, although it was an emergency hospital, I started practicing clinical medicine in a small attached outpatient clinic that was previously underutilized. However, I began to notice something strange in the hospital, later confirmed by the reports of the staff about inexplicable phenomena in the surroundings and corridors of the building. In May 2017, on a weekday, after a long day of appointments in the clinic, I went to rest in the comfort of the medical quarters when an emergency occurred. A child with a high fever and difficulty breathing was brought in hastily. Reviewing his history, I found that he suffered from asthmatic bronchitis. I acted promptly, medicating him and arranging for his admission to the pediatric ward for observation. Later, around 10 p.m., while we were outside the building, sitting on a bench, we heard voices and laughter of children. I commented to one of the nurses that I believed the patient was improving and would probably go home the next morning. After a few minutes, I got up to get some coffee. As I entered the hallway, I saw a little girl playing in front of the pediatric ward. I found it strange because I didn't remember any girl being admitted that night, as the only pediatric patient was a boy. As I approached, I saw his mother asleep in a chair next to the bed, while the boy was sitting, visibly improved and smiling, still hooked up to the medication. However, I didn't see the mentioned little girl. I asked the boy about his friend, and he whispered that she was hiding in the bathroom. Suspecting the peculiar stories of the hospital, I went to the bathroom, but I found no one. The boy let out another laugh and said she had run past. Even without seeing her, I gently scolded him, warning not to make a mess. As I turned to leave, I felt a slight tug on my lab coat. Without seeing the little girl, I just commented to be careful. As I took a few steps away, I looked back and saw her standing in the hallway before disappearing before my eyes. Surprisingly, I didn't feel afraid. On the contrary, a sense of peace washed over me. I decided to keep this experience to myself, without sharing it with my shift colleagues. After several shifts without supernatural incidents, on a weekend, around 7 in the evening, the city ambulance siren echoed, bringing a young man involved in a motorcycle accident. Shortly after, his relatives arrived, who remained in the emergency room. Unfortunately, the young man passed away minutes after being admitted. It was a sad moment, but even in the pain of loss, I witnessed something extraordinary, something that few have the privilege to witness. After allowing the family to say goodbye to the deceased young man, we moved his body to the place used as a morgue, awaiting the arrival of the funeral home for removal. When the family finally calmed down, I passed by the room where the body was and noticed a strange sound, similar to crying. For a moment, I questioned if he had really passed away. Upon opening the door, I was met with what seemed to be the specter of a man sitting on the body, facing the door. In the blink of an eye, he disappeared. This time, I decided to share the experience with Dona Inês, a nurse on duty, who agreed that perhaps the spirit of the young man had not accepted his departure. Without questioning, I retired to the comfort and said a prayer asking God to guide his soul. The month continued busy, with strange footsteps and noises during the early hours of the morning. On the next shift, around 10 p.m., the janitor, Sandro, and I were sitting on a bench in the garden in front of the emergency entrance. I noticed Sandro frequently looking towards a disused adjacent room next to my outpatient clinic. When I asked what he was observing, he pointed to a man in front of the old hospital building. Curious, I also observed and saw a man wearing a white lab coat standing outside. Then he began to approach. Concerned about his intention, we stood up, but the man simply entered my clinic. Surprisingly, the door was locked, but he passed through it as if it were open. Sandro, with surprising ease, commented that he should stay there consulting and chuckled. The calmness with which they dealt with these apparitions was unsettling. Gradually, I also got used to it. However, there were moments when I faced the intensity and violence of the dark beings, realizing how powerful they can be. On a September weekend, a young woman was brought in by her relatives due to seizures. As soon as we placed her in the clinic and I began to examine her, she grabbed my arm and started uttering incomprehensible and disjointed words. The force with which she squeezed was surprising and unpredictable. Immediately, I called for help, and that day, the nurse on duty was Bruno, a sturdy guy who still worked at the hospital. Bruno tried to restrain the young woman, but she threw him against the wall with inexplicable force. Then, she began to laugh and utter obscenities. It took the assistance of family members to restrain her, and even then, 5 people could barely hold her down. Administering a medication, popularly known as Calm the Lion, but unfortunately, it had no effect. I had to give a second dose to gradually calm her down. After the young woman calmed down, the relatives left the clinic, leaving only me and Bruno to continue the examination. When I called her by name, she opened her eyes with a look full of hatred, threatening me and uttering words of violence. Bruno tried to restrain her, but even lying down, she seemed to defy gravity. Fortunately, she suddenly fell asleep, bringing momentary relief. The next day, after being discharged, the family took her home. However, I realized that it was not just a physical or psychological condition. It was a manifestation of demonic possession, an event that exceeded the limits of explanation by science. At the end of November, during my second-to-last shift of the week, while resting in the medical quarters, I was surprised by footsteps approaching. Instinctively, I thought it was an emergency, but my body seemed to be numbed, unable to react. A blonde woman, appearing middle-aged and wearing a nurse's uniform, approached, starting to massage my feet and uttering reassuring words. Doctor, leave. Don't stay here with us. You are important. Before I could react, she disappeared before my eyes, making me jump out of bed in shock. As I stepped out into the hallway, I encountered several people, children and adults, but when I rubbed my eyes, they simply vanished. Looking back, I saw myself lying in bed. Shortly after, I woke up, this time without visions or inexplicable presences. Despite the confusion of that moment, I didn't feel afraid. I decided to stay in the town and, on weekends, travel to San Francisco. On Fridays, I consult, and on alternate weekends, I do shifts. Although my income has decreased, I now enjoy a much higher quality of life and a sense of security living in the small town. I continue to work at the hospital, and visits from another realm have become part of the routine. Like my colleagues, I have become accustomed to these apparitions. Interestingly, On several occasions, during consultations, I receive suggestions and, after confirmatory exams, confirm the diagnosis suggested by the inexplicable visitors.